thank Christian Sinclair for arranging this talk. As he mentioned, we had a conference last week in Orlando, and now my colleagues and I are driving across the United States in search of the real America, as we keep saying to one another as we're driving along. And one purpose of this talk is to give you a glimpse of what may be the real Kurdistan and how that is negotiated in oral history and oral traditions. My own research started with investigations of oral traditions and how specifically oral stories change when they're performed on location, where a particular event took place, and when they're performed off location. This has implications for developing media in the way that more and more information is being tied geographically and retrieved geographically. So imagine if you could go through a place and retrieve stories that others had left about that location, and you could leave your own. And this is becoming, of course, more and more feasible with our current devices. So looking way back to that early research of mine, this was in 2002, I was fascinated with this idea of place and the way that stories are tied to it, the way that stories reflect place. Then with my involvement in Soran University, Dr. Nahro Zagros invited me to join him on this project. And what you see today is really a fledgling piece of research. We're just now working it into a proper research article. But we began field work this past November and December, and in particular 12 informants have been particularly useful to us in the town of Shaqlawa. You'll meet a couple of them in the course of this presentation. So let me invite you to Shaklawa, again giving us a glimpse of present-day Kurdistan. This was in mid-December. It looks a bit like the Grand Canyon where we've just come from this morning. Shaklawa has about 25,000 inhabitants. That was a survey from about 2 years ago. It's probably closer to 30,000 now, especially with the influx of refugees. If you were to visit Shaklawa today, you wouldn't notice a refugee presence very obviously. It's not very apparent, but in broader Iraqi Kurdistan, it's estimated now that there are about 1 in 4 people living there are refugee, have that status. And the reason they're not noticeable is because they're living on people's balconies. They're living in whatever spare room they can find. And so what you do see is what would have normally been an open balcony has been covered over with a typical blue tarp. And that's where the refugees are staying in Shaklawa. One thing that makes it a unique town in Iraqi Kurdistan, like several others, it has a Christian identity. There's a sizable Assyrian Christian minority of about 15% of the population. This particular view down towards the city is taken from the cave of St. George. St. George, as you'll know, is revered throughout the New East in various locations, often associated with things like caves, where he was assumed to have spent some time meditating and in seclusion. I want to take you to a different angle of the city. This is looking at the town, looking towards Shaklawa. This brings us really to the subject matter of this talk, because as you'll notice here in the foreground, there are some headstones in this cemetery. They're old headstones, but they're probably not as old as the locals claim. The cemetery is called by the locals the Sahaba Cemetery, the cemetery of the companions of the Prophet. Thank you, that's great, since most of it will be visual. It's called the Sahaba Cemetery, but this is probably something of an anachronism. And the concept of anachronism actually becomes quite important when dealing with the subject of the Sahaba Cemetery. The history of the conquest, the Islamic conquest of this particular region of what is now Kurdistan, is rather murky. It wasn't written down until generations after it occurred. We're talking roughly late 7th century CE when it happened. So an anachronism that by the time this region was conquered, none of the strictly defined Sahaba would have been living, none of the immediate companions of the Prophet. But the local assumption is that the entire army were Sahaba, that they were the companions of the Prophet who were conquering this area. So that's one anachronism. The other is that these headstones, although they are clearly old, they're not 7th century. They're sandstone. They couldn't possibly be that old. So someone has either replaced the original headstones, they've been replenished over time, or this could in fact be a cemetery that has no real connection to the Islamic conquest of this region. In fact, judging by the apparent age of these stones, it could have even been some Ottoman skirmish from late 19th century. But this is all conjecture. So our project has been to interview locals, record the oral histories concerning this particular cemetery. What do people say about it? How do they view the people who are purportedly buried there? This, by the way, is Servas. He's a local historian. He works with the Handren Center for Kurdish Culture in Soran University. So the general idea about this cemetery is that no one can be buried there today. It is a sacrosanct space. And the legend has it that if you were to bury a body there today, a body of a non-Sahaba, that body would dissolve, it would disappear. Now, from my Western mindset, I'm thinking, well, that could be tremendously useful. A very easy way to get rid of the problem of bodies. But the locals have a certain fear associated with this phenomenon. I want to jump ahead to one. You can see this is at the foot of that mall. This is within 100 yards of the Sahaba Cemetery, a fresh grave. And standing at the knoll itself, you can see there's a Muslim cemetery towards the east, very much within sight. But within that plot of land, no one will be buried today. Backing up to Qadr Hamad here, he was one of our first informants. Very photogenic man, but he wasn't particularly useful. He helped us kind of get started in terms of who knows what about this cemetery, but he wanted to speak more about his own life and his hardships as a Peshmerga, as a shepherd, and as an orphan who had no inheritance of his own. We're going to do this talk as something of a tag team, so Dr. Nahro will jump in whenever he sees fit. Another interesting connection with this cemetery is the cave of Hassan Basri. Hassan Basri was presumed to be the commander of at least one of these waves of conquerors. The local legend is that the first wave of conquerors, the ones whose headstones are dotted on this knoll, were all defeated by the Turkish tribes, except for one woman who escaped to tell the tale, rather Job-like implications there. This woman escaped to tell her compatriots, and then a second wave of conquerors came and were not defeated by the Kurdish tribes. They used more strategies of persuasion to win over the tribes to Islam. So if you were to follow this path and go up into this ravine, right about here, you have the cave of Hassan Basri, where not just a military commander, but more well known today as a thinker, as a theologian, he would go to attain seclusion and have his worship there alone in the cave. That cave, like several other sites in the region, is a place of wish-making. So people will go there and tie green and white fabric onto the cliff edge or onto the local trees and make wishes as they leave that fabric. I was interested to find that there doesn't seem to be any wish-making tradition today associated with this particular cemetery, but there are nearby graves of unknown individuals that have become centers of wish-making, and similarly they're decorated with strands of green and white fabric. I think with these few photos you get a sense of the size of the cemetery. I'd estimate about 1.5 acres. And the land itself is just used for grazing for the herds in there, sheep and goat grazing. Again, you can see how fragile really this sandstone is. This is not going to be sandstone from the 7th century anyway. Also, there's no writing on these headstones. If this were a present-day Islamic cemetery, there would be visible writing on the headstones, we can assume. Now we get to some more of our informants. These 6 men are all retired from various professions, from the sewage industry to retired Peshmerga, local law enforcement, and all of them except for this man were local, but even he had moved his family to Shaqlawa in the 70s. So they all had slightly different versions of what the cemetery meant for them. I'm going to play just, give you their names and give them proper credit. I want to play just a little bit of audio so you can hear what it was like to interview them. This is an interview from December 14th. Oops, who's it going to play? Let's see. Maybe not. Is it on? I think so. The speaker's on, yeah. This may be a Mac PC.
You want to open up your Mac and play the audio from?
Sure. Yeah, let me do that because I've got it right on the desktop.
No, you just don't plug it.
Yeah, I think you can hear it, right?
Good. Oops. Sorry.
That's not the interview.
أصحابه ليش قاعدين لأن أصحابه.
إذا أصلاني بشيء أصحابه كم بشيء؟
إيه بقى أصحاب الشيء. هذه حسني بس له حتى لا جاي أو أشتكي في الشرق. حسني بس له دان يعني.
أخيرا بزون زاني.
أو تكون حاتي إمامي مربو.
أجاهم في حسن بس. وإنت كرهت فيش أصلاني.
فيش ما يفهم. ولا يوم بدون.
برك أول كذا.
Piano really didn't break in there.
Did you understand that?
Yes. Did you catch everything?
Yeah, that's Soran.
That's Sorani Kurdish.
Sorry, yes. Still not different though. Okay. Right, we interviewed these guys. We mainly questioned what they think about this cemetery and whether if the government decide to get rid of the cemetery and build malls or shopping shops or anything, what would they think? But also tell us what they heard from their ancestors about this cemetery. So again, it was mainly, it's a cemetery, it's a holy place. You can't bury anybody any local one in the cemetery because the body will dissolve or the land cannot handle the body. But we had interesting views, and what we noticed that there is a difference between the elder generation's opinion about the cemetery and the younger generation. And some people still question whether these people who came over in the 7th century, if they were actually Sahabas who came to conquer Kurdistan and spread Islam in Kurdistan, whether they were liberators or invaders. And here we asked these kind of questions, and we got different responses from individuals. But as you can see, this guy and him had different opinions, and they are slightly younger than these ones. This guy wasn't he was in the complete state of oblivion, I think.
Yeah.
We were questioning about the cemetery, or he was telling us about his own family. But anyway, these three had the view that people who came over, people who were buried there, are actually Ashabas, and they are those who came to spread Islam in Kurdistan, and Islam is the religion of peace and so forth. Therefore, they are those people were liberators. But these two had different opinions. I'll come back to that maybe later and tell you more about it.
Yeah. Also, this chap here who's fallen silent at this point in the interview, he had a very interesting, almost a folk tale, related to the whole idea of what is allowed to take place in the cemetery. He told us of a farmer who built a house on what he didn't know was part of the Sahaba Cemetery. And that night when he had finished his house building, he dreamed that there was a Sahaba warrior underneath his house. And in the morning, when he dug down, he found an uncorrupted body. And yet, according to this man, he could tell that it was a body that didn't have a soul. It was just a body that had remained uncorrupted. And so at that point, he was convinced. He tore down his house and left that land unspoiled. The other interesting thing that emerged, as Nahro was saying, we directed our questions to some of the current issues, the city planning. There's a very nearby road. Are they going to extend? Are they going to build city infrastructure over the cemetery area? And this raised different ideas. And it also raised the issue of the generational differences that Nahro mentioned. These men keenly felt the fragility of their own oral history. Many of them told us, we're convinced that our children will not carry on these stories. They don't care. And so if it's up to our children, of course they're going to mow down the cemetery. They won't know its significance. As we talked with them further, it actually emerged that they themselves had had less respect for the cemetery when they were children. A couple of them told us that on their way walking to school, they would regularly spit upon the cemetery because it was seen to be an appropriate object of such an insult. That these were not Kurds, these were invaders that deserved to have their graves spit upon, even if they were supernaturally protected graves. So that brings me to some of the ideas that I'm thinking about in relation to this cemetery. So let's take a standard definition of taboo from anthropology. And I think the cemetery fits this definition well. You have a prohibition that, if violated, is often believed to bring supernatural punishment. The cemetery could serve as exhibit A of that definition of anthropological taboo. And yet it also stands in this liminal zone. I think perhaps the simple term insult is useful here as a concept because it comes from Latin, insultare, to leap upon, to jump upon. And one etymological theory of where we get the idea of insult is that it's the idea of leaping upon, jumping upon someone's tomb in order to cause them disrespect. So insult them in that sense, leaping upon their tomb. So this cemetery exists in this gray area between generations over time. It's an appropriate object of insult for some, but it also has this taboo over it. And so that makes it, in terms of oral traditions, a particularly interesting subject of study. We were able to talk to the Mukhtar of Shaklawa, and he was perhaps the most animated storyteller. We interviewed him here in a stationery shop and also interviewed the stationery shop owner. So Hassan Kader Kabir was telling us about his own changing views. He was one of the subjects who talked about spitting on the graves as a boy walking to school, and now as an older person has much more respect for the Sahaba Cemetery. And again, I want to just play a bit of audio from him so you can get a sense of his voice. This is the Mukhtar.
زيرو شوية كيبارو بسبب كيبارو زيرو سلا بعد أو كتزيرا شيء جدوري الصوري لناقل كذبة من مصالح ما مصالح قلتي أوي أريد هو راسني كنا في سكيك لو كنا ليا كهرتي بسنا ولا يقال كيس ليه كنا كيس أتوقع تجربة نعم يقال كيس ليه يقال كيس.
What's interesting here actually, we talked about Shaklawa, but around Shaklawa, within the space of about 50 kilometers, there are several cemeteries like that, all known as Sahaba Cemetery or Sahaba Cemetery, because in Kurdish folk literature, we hear so many stories that people in that region resisted Islam. They didn't want to be conquered and or to convert into Islam, so they resisted the army. When Muslims came over, they fought for the country until everyone was killed. The people who left over, they were either the women were enslaved and the others converted into Islam forcibly. But also interestingly, whether it's true or not, interestingly, people around this region, around with this area of 50 kilometers, they are less into Islam, less into religion. Also, interestingly, you see less mosques in this region, even today. 1,300 years, 400 years after that, there are less mosques in this region than in other places around Kurdistan. So Mukhtar was telling us different stories about the caves, about the cemetery, his view about it. Like Tyler said, what was interesting here, we interviewed him in a shop which is not his shop. It's just a local guy's shop. He came there, we interviewed him. The shop owner was listening to it and while dealing with customers. Afterwards, he told us his view, which was completely different. For example, this guy, when he was a child, he was spitting at the cemetery because he regarded the people who were buried there were they were invaders. They forced people to convert into a new religion and abandon their own religion, convert into Islam. But now he has respect for the place. But the younger guy, he had no respect for the cemetery. In fact, he said, what's happening now in Iraqi Kurdistan is an interesting story. What's happening now when we are fighting ISIS or Islamic State in Iraqi Kurdistan, this is a time to reflect on what happened in the past. What we see here is history repeating itself. An Islamic State trying to include as many Sunni areas possible into their own Khalifat or Khalifat and convert people forcibly into Islam and to abide by strict Islamic rules. And exactly what happened in the 7th century when the Muslim invaders came over. Now it's time to reflect on our history and also to get rid of all these objects who are around us. It reminds Kurds of their bloody past. So.
And those objects, as in the case of the Sahaba Cemetery of Shaklawa, really serve as a microcosm of those evolving views. So with the storm clouds of ISIS on the horizon, here we see this local debate that's going on, not formally, not openly, but the way in which the Kurds of Shaklawa regard themselves vis-a-vis the encroaching invaders or liberators. Are they oppressors that deserve to be spat upon and have their cemetery removed and defaced, or are they deliverers pointing the way to a gospel truth? I think we'll conclude there and open for questions if Dr. Malik has.
I think, yes, it's just going back to the last point I was trying to articulate, is how the younger generation do question what's happening now and relate what's happening now, Islamic State trying to attack Kurdistan, and there is war going on every day with the Islamic State or the ISIS or ISIL or Daesh in local language. And they question their history, what happened in the history. They think that there is a resemblance here, what happened in 7th century, and it's happening now. And these cemeteries are these objects who are reminding people of what happened in the past. But as the result of that, there is a huge anti-religion, particularly anti-Islam movement going on among the younger population of Kurdistan. The majority talk about these cemeteries and some caves who Muslim scholars stayed in, but also the existence of mosques even in Kurdistan. Now in city planning, people are asking to have only one area designated for mosques. People are not allowed to build mosques everywhere in cities. So again, it's all the result of what's happening now when we are fighting ISIS. By the way, we have in Iraqi Kurdistan, we have a huge border with the Islamic State. It's 1,300 kilometer border, and they're attacking Kurdistan from every corner and everywhere along that border. The Islamic State is evoking people's memories, and this is one of the things that we looked at. I was trying to say something else, but I've forgotten. I don't know. It will come to me in a minute. But this cemetery is interesting because it's in a place where, until very recently, the majority of population of that place in Shaqlawa were Christians, not Muslims. And interestingly, opposite this place, this cemetery, there is another holy place of the Christians where most Kurdish Christians or Christians who are living in Kurdistan they visit that place every year, and they treat it as a pilgrimage every year. And it's exactly opposite on the other side of this cemetery.
That's the cave of Rabanboya, which is just a stone's throw, literally, away from the cave of St. George that I mentioned. In both these shrines, the cave of Rabanboya and the cave of St. George are revered by the local Christian and Muslim populations. According to our informants, the locals visit these caves regularly, but the Christians have set holidays on which they make a pilgrimage up to those caves.
Some Muslims also go there and make wishes. Do you remember when we went to the cave? They said, this is the Christian one. People will hold 7 small stones and throw it, and there is a little window of there. If all 7 stones pass the window, then their wish will come true. This is regardless whether these people are making wish are Christians or Muslims. Anyway, we'll stop here, but maybe we'll talk more about it during our discussion and question and answers.
Thank you. Nice.